Well, thanks for being here, and I hope that it's a help to you. For those who are online as well, we're going to consider the question together, does God exist? It's an important question, and that's because you can't see God, and so I know that my wife exists. Why is that? Well, because I live with her, and I see her every day. I don't even need to ask the question. But how do we know that God exists? Now, there are different realms of evidence. We have reason, science, morality, and then history. There are other realms as well, but these are the ones that we'll focus on this evening because we only have about 20-25 minutes, if I'm being naughty. And so the first for us to think about is the realm of reason, and in particular, we need God to exist to reason in the first place. What do I mean by that? Well, let me share a quote by C.S. Lewis, if this thing works. Thanks, James. So this is the quote by C.S. Lewis. Let me read it for you. So he says, supposing there was no intelligence behind the universe, no creative mind, so no God, in that case, nobody designed my brain for the purpose of thinking. It's merely that when the atoms inside my skull happen for physical or chemical reasons to arrange themselves in a certain way, this gives me as a byproduct the sensation I call thoughts. But if so, how can I trust my own thinking to be true if there's no God that designed me? It's like upsetting a milk jug and hoping that the way it splashes itself will give you a map of London. But if I can't trust my own thinking, of course I can't trust the arguments leading to atheism, and therefore have no reason to be an atheist or anything else. Unless I believe in God, I cannot believe in thought, and so I can never use thought to disbelieve in God. It's a little bit wordy, but I hope you can see what Lewis is saying. He's basically saying, look, if God doesn't exist, then my thinking is merely just the result of chemical and physical reactions going on. My brain just fizzes, and that's just it. But if that's the case, then how can I trust my thinking to be true? How can I know that my thinking is correct? Lewis, I think, is highlighting the failure of atheism to grasp what it needs to do to establish itself as a philosophy, to reason in the first place. And so atheism will always be stuck explaining how a meaningless, undesigned universe could produce meaning in the first place, morals, that is, objective morality, scientific laws like the laws of induction, and then the laws of logic as well. And so, for example, the laws of logic are what make reasoning possible. So I can have a conversation with you right now because I believe that there are certain laws that are always true. Let me give you just one example. So my car is parked outside the church right now. It is not also simultaneously parked outside my mother-in-law's garage in Australia at the same time, is it? There are laws of logic which are always true. It would be a logical impossibility. A bit like a married bachelor. That's something that is logically not possible. And you see, these things are true for everyone. If you go to Africa, you still won't find a married bachelor, or Asia or Australia. It's for everyone. It's unchanging, so this is always the case. And the laws are immaterial. So you can't see the laws of logic, you can't grab them or touch them or taste them. But here's the question that Lewis is getting at. How can we account for logic if God doesn't exist? See, atheism is the belief that everything that exists is material. That is atheism by definition, isn't it? How can you use the immaterial laws of logic if you only believe in a material universe? That's the base of C.S. Lewis's argument. He's kind of saying that God must exist to even begin the conversation in the first place. Greg Bahnsen said the same thing. He's not trying to be clever here or to do a slam dunk. I think he's just trying to go with the logic of C.S. Lewis. Greg Bahnsen said, it is wholly irrational to hold to any other position than that of Christianity. Christianity alone does not crucify reason itself. The best, the only, the absolute certain proof of the truth of Christianity is that unless its truth be presupposed, there is no proof of anything. Christianity is proved as being the very foundation of the idea of proof itself. Now, this is the most complicated of all the arguments, so if you have questions about them, you can fire them away later. But that's the realm of reason. Now, what about science? What about science? How can we know that God exists? Well, did anyone see the photos released by NASA recently of the universe? Do you remember? It was a picture taken by the James Webb Telescope, and here it is. Did everyone see that on their social media page or wherever else you look, if not social media? Does anyone think they know what all of those shining lights are? Sorry? Galaxies, yes. At first they appear like stars, but they're actually not there. They're galaxies containing billions and billions of stars. And so you sort of get a sense of the enormity of the universe with this image. Now, one of the famous arguments for the existence of God is called the argument from design. Okay? The argument from design. And so we look at the universe that God has made, and we deduce that it is designed, and therefore it has a designer. In the same way, when I look at a house, I assume it has a builder, don't I? It doesn't matter where that house is. You might find it on a desert island where there aren't any people. It doesn't matter how great the house is or how rubbish the house is. You know that if there is a house, it has a designer. And we can say the same is true of the universe. You just look at this one image, and we intuitively know it has a builder, there's a designer behind it. And so there's a famous passage in the Bible that talks about this. Here it is. It's from Romans. That's a letter that the Apostle Paul wrote. And he said this. He said, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain. What can be known about God is plain to them because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, his power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world." How? How have they been perceived? In the things that have been made, so they are without excuse. For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools. And so God has made it known that he exists in the world that he has made, and so that we are without excuse. Now, many of you will have heard of Isaac Newton. You probably learned about him in science. He's a famous scientist, and one day he invited this is a true story, he invited his atheist friend around to his house. And one afternoon, this friend noticed that Newton had a model in his study. It was a model of the solar system, and Newton's atheist friend really wanted this model. And so he said to him, "Well, who made your model?" And Newton famously said, "No one made it." And this went back and forward multiple times until Newton's friend became really angry and said, "Look, just shut up a minute. Just tell me who made it so I can go out and buy it." And Newton said this. He said, "I can't even convince you that this little model didn't have a maker. And yet you claim to believe that the real solar system that this is a poor reflection of didn't have a designer or maker?" And he said, "Do you see how ridiculous that is?" And so that's the scientific argument from design. Then we have the scientific argument of the unmoved mover. And I know slides are often distracting, so you can quickly read those before I speak. The unmoved mover. I know it's a little bit blurry, isn't it? Not quite easy to see. A man named Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century talked about infinite regress. That is, you can't have a sequence of events that goes back infinitely. It's impossible. So the reason why that's impossible is if there was an infinite sequence of events, then we'd actually never arrive at you and me today, would we? Because you'd have infinite events before we even get to us. You wouldn't exist. So you'd never get to today. Let me just explain it this way. If I want to pass my phone to you, Colin, but I need to pass it to an infinite number of people before I pass it to you, will it ever get to Colin? No. And so this is important. You can't have an infinite sequence of events. And so Aquinas used this argument, and it's famously called the unmoved mover. Everything that we observe in this world is created, and so if you move, you've changed. And so for me, I like to put on weight, it seems, and my hair continues to go grey. If you're young, you grow up taller. Everything changes in this world. And Aquinas noted that everything that's changed has been changed by something else. And that thing was changed by something else. See, everything you see in this room there's a sequence of events, isn't there? So that chair sitting right there, someone put that chair there, and before they did that, it was somewhere else, and whoever put that chair there, they were put there by someone, and on and on it goes. But remember, there's not an infinite sequence of regress. There has to be an unchanged changer, or an unmoved mover. There needs to be a hand that touches the first domino to get it all going. And that unmoved mover is God himself. So that's the argument of the unmoved mover. Then we have what's called the Kalam cosmological argument. It's a very famous argument in the world of apologetics. It was popularized by a philosopher named William Lane Craig. And it goes something like this. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. So whatever that might be, everything you see, it has a cause. Secondly, the universe began to exist. And therefore, point 3, it all follows. Therefore, the universe has a cause. And point 4, if the universe has a cause, then an uncaused, unmoved creator of the universe exists who is beginningless and powerful. In other words, God. Now, some people try to debate the second point. Did the universe really begin to exist? And I think we can see scientific evidence that the universe did, in fact, begin to exist, didn't it? I know atheists often will use the language of the Big Bang, but whatever you call it, it seems that the universe started at a point in time, a singularity, and the universe is expanding. And so, if you click that into reverse, well, there was a time when the universe was not. It hasn't gone on forever. But what about God? Because that's another question that's sometimes asked, isn't it? I've been asked this so many times before. What caused or what moved God? But just look at that first sentence again, carefully. Does it say that everything that exists has a cause? No, it says that everything that begins to exist has a cause. The definition of God is a being that didn't begin to exist. See, God calls himself I am. That is, he is, who he has always been, and who he will always be. He has aseity. It means he's self-dependent, self-existent. He doesn't depend on anything to be who he is. And so, the question who created God actually doesn't work because the definition of God is one who is uncreated. God doesn't need a cause because he didn't come into existence. And so that's a really, I've got to speak fast because I've got to get through enough arguments in 20 minutes. But that's a quick whistle-stop tour of the scientific arguments. Again, if you're not sure about any of those or you've got questions, ask me after. Next we have what's called the moral argument, the argument from morality. And we need to begin by asking the question, is there objective morality? Is there morality that is true for all time, for all people? And I think actually we know that there is. See, when you're old enough to know what murder is, you know that murder is wrong. Your mind is structured in such a way that when you're just old enough, if our mind is functioning properly, we intuitively know that murder is wrong. Now, you can be talked out of that by propaganda or by imbalanced chemicals in the brain. All of that stuff, I get that. But a properly functioning brain knows that murder and the Holocaust and all the evil things that people do to one another in the world is wrong. That's why we get upset about it. But of course, the question is, how can we know it is objectively, definitely wrong in the atheist worldview? Because isn't it just an opinion? If there's no God, then can't you say, well, then you can't say this is the right way to live and this is the wrong way to live, can you? Because how do you know that murdering someone is wrong? See, without purpose, you can't determine good or bad. What one dog does to another dog is morally irrelevant, isn't it? Even Professor Dawkins admits this. He said, in a universe of blind forces, there's no good, no justice, no evil. Things just happen. And Dawkins says we just dance to our own DNA. And that means we're just machines. And so if we're just machines, then murdering someone is morally irrelevant. It's no different than when a snake kills another snake. You can't actually get aught from biology, can you? You can't get aught from biology. You only get what is. How do we have moral obligations if there's no moral law giver. Now, you might get sentiments where people will say, well, I have the idea that love is better than murder, but you're not obligated to obey it if there's no objective moral standard. It's just an opinion. And as we know, even again, Dawkins admits that Darwinism is all about the survival of the fittest. And he says, I don't want to live in a Darwinian morality. Should we kill the weak so the strongest can survive? Well, that's what Hitler did in Germany, didn't he? See, if there's no God, there's nothing ultimately right or wrong. And if you say that evolution gives you moral sentiments, then they're exactly that, just sentiments. They're actually not binding on us as humans. And so where does the conscience come from? How do we know that it's better to love someone than to hate them? How do we know that? That it's better to love someone than to hate them? Atheism can't explain that. And so we have this argument. Number one, if God doesn't exist, then objective moral values don't exist. Point number two, objective moral values do exist, as we've seen. And so thirdly, therefore, God exists. You only get ought from a God who is the standard of goodness. It comes top down, not bottom up. That's why C.S. Lewis once said, you only have an idea of straight when you know, you have to have an idea of straight in order to know what crooked is. You have to have an idea of straight to know what crooked is. You need to know the rules of the game. And you know, the idea is we can understand when something is wrong, and that reveals that we have something outside of opinion. There's always a standard that we appeal to. And so Lewis, writing during World War II, said, if you want to argue that the Allies' set of ideas is better than the Nazi ideas, we are implying that there's a standard behind both of them to which you're comparing. If you want to argue that the Allies' set of ideas is better than the Nazi ideas, you're implying there's a standard behind both of them to which you're comparing, outside of England, outside of Germany, and that standard is God's nature. And so our conscience about what is good is evidence that we are made in God's image and that we live in a God-structured universe. That is the argument from morality. Now let me just conclude with the final piece of evidence for God's existence. Well, there's plenty more, but one more tonight, and that's the person of Jesus. The person of Jesus. Now we'll have an entire evening thinking about Jesus' existence, so I'm not going to go over that ground, but we'll look at 5 key areas. It's actually 5 facts that every historian can agree with. Most historians agree with these, and they support the resurrection. And if Jesus rose from the dead, well, then it truly vindicates his claims about God. Firstly, Jesus was crucified and he died on the cross. This is a fact that no real historian contends with. The evidence for that's overwhelming. We have all the documents we find in the Bible. Remember, the Bible isn't one book, it's 66 books written by lots of different authors. And the 4 Gospels are eyewitness accounts of what happened to Jesus. And so we have 4 documents just there. And then we have Romans, Greeks, and Jewish historians living at the time of Jesus who also wrote about Jesus' death on the cross. It's not recorded in the Bible, but you can look at these sources as well. And so it's pretty uncontroversial. That's the first thing. Secondly, Jesus was buried. He was buried by a man named Joseph. That's, again, uncontested. Jesus was laid in a tomb. Thirdly, Jesus' followers found the tomb empty. They found the tomb empty. And the objection, of course, is that the disciples stole the body and then they created this religion. But what that doesn't account for is the fact that women were the first eyewitnesses of the empty tomb. It doesn't account for that. Because if you steal the body and then you make up a story, you don't have women as the first eyewitnesses. And don't throw rocks at me. That is because women just weren't trusted in the ancient world. They had no say in a court of law, and so it's a very embarrassing detail to include. It doesn't help your case at all if you're making up a story. You wouldn't include it at all. No one's ever done that. No one would include it. You wouldn't include it. Unless, of course, it actually happened that way and they were recording the events. Fourthly, in the early days, the disciples experienced something that caused them to zealously preach Christ and the gospel. See, when Jesus was nailed to the cross, his disciples went into hiding. They were shaking in their boots. They wanted to make sure that they wouldn't die too. And they were discouraged, weren't they, that Jesus wasn't with them. And so they went into hiding. But something changes. And the question is, well, what suddenly changes? They suddenly become bold in the face of the sword. And there's a quote, isn't there, that liars make the worst martyrs. Liars make the worst martyrs. Because you may have someone who dies for something that's not true. That happens all the time in the world. But who would die for something that they know is not true? Who would die for something that they absolutely know is not true? And so what would make them suddenly bold? Why do they all go to their deaths? And it's because they really saw the resurrected Jesus. They saw Jesus die, and they saw Jesus come back to life again. That's the only reason why they would go from cowardice to bold and defending this thing even unto death. And then finally, number 5, certain people who were unlikely to accept the message of resurrection actually did accept it. And so James, the brother of Jesus, which is fascinating, isn't it, accepted the message. What would it take to convince a brother that you're God among men and that you died for the sin of the world and came back to life again? What would Jesus have to do to convince his brother? They grew up together. They did all the things that brothers do, the normal fun things that young boys do. To have a brother say, I believe that you are the Son of God. What would it take? Paul, the Apostle Paul, is another one. He was killing Christians and capturing them, and then he turns around and becomes a Christian and loses his life under Nero. How can we justify that? How can we justify these things? People who had every reason to reject the claims of Jesus. Paul was a man who was on his way to become an elite leader in Judaism. Top of the chain, and he threw it all away. The only thing that makes sense is that Paul really saw the resurrected Lord Jesus. And so to put all of that together, really brief, there will be time for questions. I know that was quick. We have good reasons to believe in the claims of Christianity. Not only that some God out there exists, but the God who has made himself known in the person of Jesus, who's come to die for our sins, to bring us back to the Father, who rose from the dead to vindicate all of his claims, and the one who calls us into eternal life through faith alone. This is the God who exists, and this is the God who has made himself known to us.